In every empire, behind every throne, there's a woman history tried to silence. Queens who didn't just rule, they seduced, rebelled, and redefined power on their own terms. This isn't a love story. It's a battlefield of desire, ambition, and scandal. From poisoned palaces to blood-stained boudoirs, these are the 30 most dangerously irresistible queens in history. You've heard of their crown, Snow? Hear their secrets. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button if you love history with a sharp edge. We've got plenty more dark queens and deadly stories coming your way. And tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Let's see how far this royal chaos travels. Cleopatra VII. Picture this. The desert sun blazes over Alexandria, turning golden statues into molten mirrors. Columns stretch skyward like stone spears, casting long shadows across marble floors. And at the heart of it all sits Cleopatra VII barefoot, brilliant and burning, with more than just political ambition. She's 21 years old when Julius Caesar sails into Egypt. Rome's most feared general meets Egypt's most powerful woman, and suddenly the future of two empires hangs on a whispered conversation. Not a war, not a treaty, but Cleopatra. Let's set the record straight. Cleopatra wasn't just beautiful, she was dangerous with a sentence. Fluent in at least 7 languages, educated in philosophy, mathematics, astronomy. She wasn't seducing, she was strategizing. Her relationships with Caesar and later Mark Antony weren't just steamy soap opera chapters, they were chess moves on a board soaked in blood. And she played like a grandmaster. But history, especially Roman history, tends to get dramatic. According to their scrolls, Cleopatra wasn't just politically savage, was a temptress who turned mighty men into lovesick fools. A siren who turned warships, a queen who used her bedroom like a battlefield. Exaggeration? Of course, but not baseless. Because Cleopatra knew the power of proximity. She hosted Caesar in her palace, had his child, and when he was assassinated, she pivoted. Enter Mark Antony, Roman war hero, one of the most powerful men alive. Cleopatra met him on a golden barge floating down the river like a scene from a fever, dream-perfumed, sails, music, servants dressed as gods. He was hooked. Rome noticed. Together, Cleopatra and Antony ruled like a duo from myth. They threw festivals, minted coins with both their faces, and even created their own drinking club, the Inimitable Livers. But behind the glam was a storm brewing. Rome wasn't fond of sharing power, and the Senate saw this East meets West alliance as a threat to the Republic. So, it ended as all great obsessions do, with a war. The Battle of Actium was a naval disaster for Cleopatra and Antony. Defeated and cornered, they died in a storybook, tragedy by sword. She allegedly by snakebite. Poetic. Almost too perfect. But regardless of how she died, Cleopatra didn't go quietly. She exited history like she entered it. Larger than life, wrapped in rumor and awe. Why was she extreme? Because Cleopatra flipped the script. In a world where men made history and women decorated the margins, she turned herself into a headline. Her power wasn't just political, it was personal. She embodied what terrified Rome, a woman who didn't beg, but bargained, who didn't seduce to submit, but to reign. Cleopatra used intimacy like an empire, uses diplomacy, tactically, effectively, and unapologetically. And whether she was truly insatiable or just insatiably misunderstood, one thing is certain, Cleopatra was the original scandal. But she was just the spark. Because if you think Cleopatra had a flair for the dramatic, Wait until you meet the woman who allegedly challenged Rome's prostitutes to an all-night contest, and won, Messalina. She was born into a dynasty of Roman elites, the kind of bloodline that oozed ambition and polished cruelty. Valeria, Messalina third wife to Emperor Claudius, wouldn't just make her mark on Rome. She'd carve it into its walls with the sharp edge of scandal. If Cleopatra was a chess player, Messalina was a fire starter. From the outside, she fit the mold. Young, beautiful, tied to the most powerful man in the empire. But Rome didn't just whisper about Messalina, they gasped. Historians, especially the gossipy kind like Suetonius and Tacitus, didn't hesitate to paint her as the ultimate femme fatale. They claimed she burned through lovers like torches in a palace hallway. That her appetite was more than political. It was legendary. Now, take that with a Roman grain of salt. These were senators and scribes who feared powerful women like they feared barbarian invasions. But even with the inevitable exaggerations, there's no denying Messalina lived on the edge and then jumped off it head first. She wasn't just a consort. She was a conspirator, a schemer, a queen of manipulation cloaked in silk. While Emperor Claudius, buried himself in scrolls and trivia, was known to be bookish, awkward, and easily swayed, Messalina ruled the court. She orchestrated executions, arranged marriages, positioned allies, and, according to Roman rumors, turned the imperial palace into her personal playground. The most famous tale? A scandal so lurid it sounds like a rejected soap opera subplot. They say Messalina disguised herself as a common woman, snuck out at night, and competed with Rome's top courtesan in a kind of erotic Olympics who could entertain the most men in one night. The courtesan reportedly gave up at 25. Messalina kept going. The historian Juvenal, never one to resist a juicy exaggeration, immortalized this rumor in his satires. Now, whether or not this orgiastic marathon ever happened is almost beside the point. The fact that Romans believed it or wanted to says everything about how she was seen. Dangerous, wild, shameless. A kind of living myth, half woman, half wildfire. But her ambition wasn't all in the shadows. Messalina's real scandal wasn't what she did in secret, it was what she dared to do in daylight. While still married to Claudius, she publicly married another man, Gaius Silius, one of the most handsome and politically promising men in Rome, in front of witnesses, with full ceremony, as if the emperor she was still married to didn't exist. The brazenness of it stunned the empire. Some historians claimed it was a plot to overthrow Claudius and install Silius as emperor. Others say it was pure madness, or maybe the ultimate power grab. Either way, it didn't end well. When Claudius found out, his advisors convinced him that Messalina was plotting his assassination. And in the cold, calculated machinery of imperial politics, there's only one outcome for betrayal. She was executed without trial, reportedly stabbed in the gardens of Lucullus. She was only about 28. Why was Messalina extreme? Because she didn't wait for history to give her a place as she barged into it, crown tilted, eyes blazing. Whether the stories about her are truth, myth, or somewhere in the mess in between, her legacy is clear. She was a woman Rome couldn't control, and so they tried to destroy her memory. And yet, here we are. Messalina's legend lives on not because she was perfect, but because she was impossible to ignore. She reminds us that power, when paired with desire, scares people more than war. And speaking of terrifying maternal ambition, what happens when a woman gives birth to an emperor and maybe, just maybe, seduces him too? 2 queens down and things are already getting scandalous. If you're hooked, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next royal meltdown. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And what time is it in your kingdom right now? Let's see which time zone loves the drama most. Agrippina the Younger, born into power, raised by wolves, crowned by cunning. Agrippina the Younger didn't just survive the brutal blood sport of Roman politics, she mastered it. From the moment she opened her eyes, the empire was already woven into her destiny. She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus, niece to Emperor Tiberius, sister to Emperor Caligula, wife to Emperor Claudius, and mother to Emperor Nero. If Rome had a royal family, she was its dark matriarch, the Black Widow, seated at the head of the table. And unlike the marble busts and grainy scrolls that tried to sanitize her, Agrippina's life played out like a slow-burning thriller. The kind of plot where everyone smiles at dinner, knowing someone's goblet is poisoned. She was orphaned early, exiled young, and underestimated often, but she always returned, sharper, colder, more calculating. When her brother Caligula took the throne, Agrippina briefly enjoyed status at court, but Caligula was unstable, and when he turned on his own blood, she was banished. Strike one. Years later, she married a wealthy Roman noble and had her son Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. We'll call him by the name history knows best, Nero. Strike two came when her second husband died suddenly. Some whispered that Agrippina had a hand in it. Poison? Possibly. Convenient timing? Absolutely. It wouldn't be the last suspicious death in her orbit. When Claudius became emperor, Agrippina did what ambitious women often had to do. She married him, her own uncle. A union that turned the stomachs of many Romans, but ticked every political box. She became empress, adopted her son into the imperial bloodline, and positioned him as heir over Claudius's biological son. Then, in the grand tradition of Roman plot twists, Claudius mysteriously died. The mushrooms did it, they say. Or, more specifically, a dish of poisoned mushrooms hand prepared by Agrippina herself. Whether or not she did the deed, one thing is certain. Within hours, Nero was emperor, and Agrippina stood behind the throne, draped in authority. At first, she ruled through him. Coins were minted with both their faces, a symbol of dual power unheard of for women. She sat in on Senate meetings, issued edicts, controlled appointments. Rome wasn't just whispering no, it was shouting. This wasn't a mother guiding her son. This was a co-ruler wrapped in maternal silk. But teenage emperors grow restless, especially when their mothers don't let them play king alone. As Nero aged, he began to pull away seeking lovers, advisors, and eventually escape from her shadow. What followed was one of history's most chilling family dramas. Nero first tried to sideline her politically. Then, he allegedly tried to kill her. The stories read like pulp fiction, collapsing boats, staged drownings, rigged ceilings. When subtlety failed, he sent soldiers. Agrippina died as dramatically as she lived, stabbed in her villa. Her last words reportedly an invitation to strike the womb that birthed him. Whether or not that quote is real, it fits. Because Agrippina didn't just raise an emperor, she created one, and he repaid her in blood. Why was Agrippina extreme? Because she broke every mold Rome tried to shove her into. She wasn't content being the wife, the sister, or the mother. She wanted power in her own name. She wielded her body, her lineage, her intellect all as weapons in a game that left most women silenced or sidelined. Agrippina stood at the center of empire and dared to reach for the crown. And if her son became a monster, well, maybe she taught him too well. But speaking of former performers turned empresses, what happens when a stage girl from the streets of Constantinople becomes the most powerful woman in Byzantium? Empress Theodora. Before she wore silk robes, she wore stage paint. Before she ruled beside the most powerful man in the Byzantine Empire, she danced in the alleys and spoke her lines on the low boards of Constantinople's seediest stages. And before she became a saint in the eyes of the Orthodox Church, she was, according to her enemies, nothing short of a scandal wrapped in velvet. This was Empress Theodora, born around 500 CE, raised among acrobats, actresses, and whispers. Her early life reads more like a fable than a biography. Daughter of a bear trainer for the city's chariot races, Theodora entered the theater as a child, not the marble-columned amphitheaters of high drama, but the grimy, chaotic world of mimes, satire, and, yes, sex work. The lines between performance and prostitution in Byzantine popular entertainment were blurred, and Theodora learned quickly that beauty was power, but wit, timing, and audacity were even stronger currency. She was famous for her performances, infamous for her offstage liaisons, and unforgettable for her charisma. Even her critics, especially the historian Procopius, couldn't deny her magnetism, though he spat venom at her legacy, calling her lascivious, cruel, manipulative. He couldn't stop writing about her. No one could. And then just like that, the actress disappeared. She left Constantinople, traveled to North Africa, converted to a more ascetic Christian life, and returned a transformed woman. But make no mistake, this wasn't a full repentance. Theodora didn't erase her past, she refined it into armor. Enter Justinian, heir to the Eastern Roman Empire. He was serious, scholarly, cold to the bone. But when he met Theodora, something thawed. He fell in love not with a virgin or a noblewoman, but with a former performer. To marry her, he had to convince the emperor to change the law forbidding high officials from marrying actresses. Justinian didn't hesitate. The law bent. The court gasped. And Theodora became Augusta Empress of Byzantium. Now, if you're expecting a quiet life of royal banquets and embroidery, forget it. Theodora was no silent consort. She sat in council meetings, dictated policies, advised during crises. And when the city exploded in rebellion during the Nika riots, Justinian wanted to flee. Theodora didn't flinch. She reportedly told him, "Royalty is a fine burial shroud." Translation, "We die here, or we rule it." Justinian stayed. The rebellion was crushed, and Theodora's legend grew. But let's not airbrush her into sainthood just yet. Theodora's enemies described her as vindictive, shrewd, and unsparing. She punished rivals, exiled critics. She helped craft policies that protected women from exploitation, including stricter laws against forced prostitution, perhaps a nod to her past. She built convents for former sex workers, reformed marriage laws, and whispered decisions that reshaped imperial politics from behind a silk curtain. Her sexuality, real or exaggerated, became a permanent part of her mythos. Even as an empress, Procopius claimed, she was insatiable. He accused her of mocking morality while manipulating men with a smile and a slow turn of phrase. These accounts, dripping with contempt, reveal as much about their authors as they do about Theodora. She wasn't meant to rise. She was supposed to stay in the alleys, forgotten like a smudged playbill. But Theodora rewrote the script. She moved from a role of spectacle to a throne of steel, turning a life of scandal into a reign of power. Why was Theodora extreme? Because she dared to be everything a woman was not supposed to be in Byzantium. Sensual, smart, defiant, loyal, brutal. She turned her past into leverage, her lover into a partner, and her empire into a legacy. Theodora wasn't trying to be forgiven, she was demanding to be remembered. And remembered she is. But now, Let's sail north, to a frostbitten court where a German princess would transform into a Russian titan, a woman whose lovers were as numerous as her reforms and nearly as famous. Catherine the Great. The snow outside was endless. Endless forests, endless silence. And in the middle of that frozen empire sat a throne too heavy for most men to bear, yet it belonged, almost unbelievably, to a woman who wasn't even born Russian. She was born Sophie Friederike Auguste of Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German princess, more likely to marry into mediocrity than greatness. But fate and her mother's fierce matchmaking landed her in Russia at the age of 14. Her mission: marry the heir to the Russian Empire, a boy named Peter. Peter III, awkward, cruel, volatile, obsessed with toy soldiers and German uniforms. Historians describe him as a man who played emperor like a child, plays with firecrackers, clumsy, dangerous, and loud. Sophie, now Catherine, watched, waited, learned. She read Voltaire and Montesquieu by candlelight, studied Russian history, mastered the language, the customs, the court, and most importantly, she learned how to disappear behind a smile while planning her next move. By the time Peter ascended to the throne, Catherine had already won the people's hearts. Peter lasted 6 months. Then, in a coup so swift it felt like fate itself, Catherine seized power. Her husband was arrested. A few days later, he was dead. Accidentally. Conveniently. And Catherine became Empress of Russia. She ruled for 34 years. But her reign wasn't just long, it was revolutionary. She modernized Russia, reformed education, expanded the empire's borders, and corresponded with the Enlightenment's greatest thinkers. She was a philosopher in pearls, a general in a corset, and a monarch who ruled as well, if not better, than any man before her. And yet, that's not what people remember first, is it? The rumors began almost as soon as she took the throne. That she had countless lovers, that she kept a rotating court of favorites, all hand-picked, well-dressed, and mysteriously promoted after their time in her chambers. Some were nobles. Some were guards. Some were merely beautiful. It wasn't just gossip, it was a campaign, whispered by foreign enemies, echoed by jealous courtiers. Even now, centuries later, her name is tangled with one of history's most infamous and unfounded myths, a grotesque tale involving a horse, whispered behind closed doors and scribbled in the margins of dusty books. A story so absurd it speaks more about how society fears powerful women than anything it claims about her. Because here's the truth. Catherine the Great had lovers, many of them, and she made no secret of it. In a world where kings routinely had mistresses, lovers, and illegitimate children by the dozen, Catherine flipped the script. She treated her romances with the same strategic elegance as her politics. Some lovers stayed for years, others were politely dismissed with titles, lands, and pensions. But none of them ruled her. She wrote frankly about love and intimacy in her letters. She believed in companionship, passion, and yes, pleasure. But she also believed in control. Catherine was the center of her courtal ways. Her relationships weren't scandals. They were statements, a declaration that she would not live under the expectations written by men who feared women like her. Why was Catherine extreme? Because she wasn't just a woman in power. She was a woman who wielded power, enjoyed pleasure, and refused to apologize for either. She didn't hide behind her crown. She redefined what a crown could mean. Empress, lover, reformer, conqueror Catherine made Russia modern, and she did it without ever pretending to be less than what she was. She didn't bend, she ruled. But what happens when that kind of ambition crosses continents? When a woman in imperial China dares to do what no other woman before or after ever could? When she doesn't just rule beside a man, she becomes the emperor herself? Wu Zetian. China's imperial court was a place of silk and shadow. Behind the golden screens, emperors ruled with the mandate of heaven, and women, even the most privileged, were expected to stay quiet, graceful, and invisible. But not her. Wu Zetian did not stay invisible. She was born in 624 CE, during the Tang dynasty, into a wealthy family of influence but not nobility. At 14, she entered the imperial palace as a concubine to Emperor Taizong. There, she was one of many a decorative face among hundreds. Yet she stood out, not because she was the most beautiful, but because she was the most patient. When Taizong died, the tradition was cruelly clear. Imperial concubines without children were sent to Buddhist convents to live out their days in silent exile. Wu went, but her silence didn't last. She re-emerged, astonishingly, in the court of Taizong's son, Emperor Gaozong, who, history whispers, had been fascinated by her even before his father's death. Wu returned not just as a courtesan, but as his favorite, then his consort, then his empress, and then the real story began. Because Wu Zetian didn't come to court to play nice, she came to rule. One by one, her rivals fell. The empress she replaced, accused of witchcraft and executed. Concubines who opposed her, silenced, exiled, or erased. Children who threatened her hold on power, stripped of titles, disinherited or worse. She didn't just maneuver through the palace, she owned it. When Emperor Gaozong suffered a stroke, it was Wu who governed behind the throne. She attended state councils, issued orders, managed appointments, and once Gaozong died, she didn't give up that power. She tightened her grip. First, she ruled through her sons, acting as Empress Dowager. But regency wasn't enough. Wu Zetian wanted full, undisputed power, and in 690 CE, she took it. Officially, publicly. She declared herself emperor, not empress consort, not empress dowager emperor, the only woman in over 2 millennia of Chinese dynastic history to do so. She founded her own dynasty, Zhou dynasty, interrupting the Tang. She wore the dragon robe, sat on the dragon throne, and demanded to be addressed with the titles of emperors past. And while her methods were ruthless, her reign was visionary. She promoted merit over aristocratic birth, opening pathways to government for scholars and officials from humbler origins. She strengthened the civil service exams. She supported Buddhism, built temples, and commissioned texts that emphasized compassion and enlightenment, though always in alignment with her image as ruler. But Wu's personal life was no less bold than her politics. She was known to take lovers, particularly in her later years, most famously the Zhang brothers, 2 handsome young men who became fixtures at her court and symbols of her unapologetic authority. Where emperors were praised for virility, Wu was vilified for desire. Where male rulers were allowed decadence, Wu was accused of corruption. She didn't care. She didn't reign to please her critics. She reigned to outlast them. And she nearly did. She ruled as emperor for 15 years, and even after her forced abdication in old age, her legacy remained unshakable. The Tang dynasty resumed, but the memory of Wu Zetian haunted the throne for generations. A reminder that a woman had once dared to take the mandate of heaven and held it. Why was Wu Zetian extreme? Because she shattered the rules of gender, power, and succession in the most hierarchical empire on earth. She didn't flirt her way to the top, she fought. She ruled, and she rewrote the meaning of what a ruler could be. She wasn't content with whispering behind the curtain. She tore the curtain down and built a throne in its place. And as we cross from China's imperial courts to the misty highlands of Scotland, the legacy of another royal woman emerges caught between marriages, religions, assassins, and scandal. Mary, Queen of Scots. She was born into a throne, baptized into drama, and buried beneath a legend soaked in scandal. Mary, Queen of Scots, was royalty before she could walk and a fugitive before she could grow old. Her life wasn't just a royal tragedy. It was a political thriller, with a heartbreak soundtrack and more than a few questionable men. From the moment she drew breath in 1542, Mary Stuart was queen. Her father, James V of Scotland, died just 6 days after her birth. That made her an infant monarcha crown heavy enough to snap a baby's neck, and yet one she carried all her life. At 5 years old, she was sent to France to be raised among kings. It was part education, part political insurance policy. And in the gilded French court, Mary grew into a young woman of striking beauty, sharp intellect, and undeniable charisma. She charmed everyone from nobles to poets to her eventual husband, the young Dauphin, Francis. They married. He became king. She became queen consort of France. And then, 18 months later, he died. Just like that, Mary was a widow at 18 and a queen without a kingdom. She returned to Scotland, a land she hadn't seen in 13 years, now riddled with Protestant rebellion, clan warfare, and political vipers lurking in every smoky castle corridor. She returned Catholic, French-trained, and glittering with continental polish. And Scotland? Scotland didn't know what to do with her. But Mary, for all her youth and grace, wasn't here to play duchess. She was queen, and she intended to rule. And rule she did. But she also loved. And that's where the story starts twisting into the kind of tabloid fare that keeps historians up at night. Her second marriage was to Henry Stuart, Lord Donlea, tall, handsome, noble, with a royal bloodline almost as good as hers. On paper, it was a political dream. In reality, it was a Shakespearean disaster. Darnley was arrogant, violent, and paranoid. He demanded power. She gave him titles. He demanded respect. She gave him side-eye. The honeymoon didn't last long. Soon, Darnley was sulking through the palace, picking fights, and growing jealous of Mary's close advisor, David Rizzio. In a scene so dramatic it feels scripted, Darnley and a group of nobles stormed into Mary's private rooms, dragged Rizzio out, and murdered him, stabbed over 50 times in front of the pregnant queen. That was the beginning of the end. Mary withdrew. Darnley's days were numbered, and when he turned up, dead blown up in a suspicious explosion, then found strangled in the garden, people didn't just raise eyebrows, they pointed fingers. At Mary. More scandal followed when, just 3 months later, she married James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, the very man suspected of killing Darnley. Was it love, lust, politics, or coercion? Historians still debate it, but the optics were disastrous. The Scottish nobles revolted. Mary was captured, forced to abdicate. Her infant son, James VI, was crowned without her. She escaped, fled to England, sought protection from her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I. But Elizabeth didn't offer sanctuary. She offered prison. For 19 years, Mary was held in English castles, still a queen, but now more myth than monarch. Catholic plots and royal uprisings continued to swirl around her name. She became a symbol of resistance, of legitimacy, of danger, and eventually of treason. In 1586, she was implicated in the Babington Plota plan to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne. Whether she was complicit or simply the bait in a larger game doesn't matter. The crown demanded blood. Mary was tried, convicted, and beheaded. She wore red to her execution, the color of Catholic martyrdom. Even in death, she was playing to the audience. Why was Mary Queen of Scots extreme? Because she dared to rule with both her heart and her crown. She made mistakes spectacular ones, loved recklessly, married poorly, trusted badly. But she was never passive. She made choices, claimed her power, lived on Diedas, a queen who refused to be anything less than unforgettable. And speaking of unforgettable, what happens when a queen's love story isn't just controversial but allegedly magical? When whispers of sorcery swirl around her crown like perfume in a court of enemies. 7 queens in, and we've barely scratched the surface. Things are only getting wilder from here. If you're loving the ride through Royal Rebellion, make sure to subscribe. And let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from? And what time of night or day are you falling down this historical rabbit hole? Elizabeth Woodville. She was called a witch, a sorceress, a seductress in silver, a commoner with a widow's veil who married a king and bewitched an entire nation. At least, that's how the rumors went. Elizabeth Woodville was born around 1437 into the chaos of the Wars of the Rosacea time, when English thrones changed hands like playing cards, and bloodlines were drawn with swords. Her family, the Woodvilles, were nobility, but not nobility enough. They were seen as upstarts, ambitious, untrustworthy, and Elizabeth? She was considered dangerously beautiful, with an air of mystery that turned court gossip into wildfire. She was first married to Sir John Grey, a knight loyal to the House of Lancaster. He died in battle, leaving her a widow with 2 sons. A woman alone, in a country where widows were more vulnerable than paupers. But Elizabeth wasn't interested in staying quiet or powerless. She had a plan. According to legend, and what a legend it is, she waited under a tree beside the road where King Edward IV would pass. Holding her 2 sons, dressed in mourning, she petitioned the young, impulsive Yorkist king for the return of her late husband's lands. Some say she fell to her knees. Others say she held a dagger to her own throat to plead her case. Whatever happened under that tree, it worked. Edward fell in love, hard and fast. Despite his advisor's protests, despite the outrage of his closest ally, the powerful Earl of Warwick, Edward married Elizabeth in secret. A commoner, a widow, and, some whispered, a woman who used spells and charms to make the king fall under her sway. That whisper sorcery would follow her for the rest of her life. When their marriage was finally announced, the court exploded. The nobility were furious. Elizabeth's relatives, the Woodvilles, were suddenly elevated into positions of power, marrying into aristocratic families, securing titles, swarming the court like velvet-draped meteors. To some, it looked like social climbing. To others, it was a full-scale invasion. And Elizabeth? She didn't back down. She bore Edward 10 children, 5 daughters and 5 sons, cementing her legacy and strengthening her grip on the royal line. She hosted lavish ceremonies, supported the arts, built political alliances, and quietly outmaneuvered the men who tried to push her back into obscurity. But her life was no fairy tale. Edward died unexpectedly in 1483, leaving their eldest son, Edward V, as the heir. He was only 12. And before he could be crowned, he and his younger brother Elizabeth's boys were taken into the Tower of London by their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. They were never seen again. The princes in the Tower, one of history's great, unsolved mysteries. Elizabeth believed, as many still do, that Richard had them killed to claim the throne, and he did becoming Richard III, Elizabeth was forced into hiding. She conspired with Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry Tudor, to unite their claims through marriage. When Henry defeated Richard at the Battle of Bosworth and became Henry VII, Elizabeth's daughter, Elizabeth of York, married him, uniting the warring houses and founding the Tudor dynasty. It was the ultimate long game, played by a queen who was never supposed to be queen at all. Why was Elizabeth Woodville extreme? Because she wasn't born into a crown, she claimed it. She navigated the brutal chessboard of English succession with a mix of maternal instinct, political savvy, and a whispered hint of the supernatural. Whether or not she ever cast a spell, one thing is clear. She enchanted an empire. And as the Tudor age begins, another woman steps forward, not born royal, but elevated by love, adored by a king, and immortalized in a painting where her sister tweaks her nipple. Yes, really, Diane de Poitiers. In the grand theaters of power, some women steal the spotlight without ever claiming the throne. Diane de Poitiers never wore a crown, but she ruled a king's heart and, by extension, ruled France itself. Born in 1499 into minor nobility, Diane entered court life young and fast. She married Louis de Brezé, a much older courtier, and became a widow by her early 30s. But it was what happened after her mourning veil came off that turned her into legend. Diane was elegant, refined, fiercely intelligent, and according to nearly everyone who saw her ageless, she had a nearly supernatural beauty that outlasted decades, and she cultivated that aura with cold precision. Milk baths, rigid diets, ice-cold discipline. She dressed only in black and white, wore her hair high and her gaze higher. She didn't just walk into rooms, she moved like smoke in candlelight. And then came Henri. Henry II, future King of France, met Diane when he was just 11 years old and held hostage in Spain. She was his guardian of sorts, his confidant, his muse. By the time he returned to France, their bond had deepened into something else, something scandalous, something strategic. She was 20 years older than him. And yet, Henry fell for her completely. Even after he married Catherine de' Medici, a political alliance with one of the most powerful families in Europe, Henri kept Diane as his chief mistress. But mistress doesn't even begin to cover it. Diane wasn't a fling. She was a dynasty. Henry trusted her more than any advisor. She signed royal documents, received ambassadors, controlled access to the king. Her crestu, interlocked desoirs carved into palaces, fountains, even the king's armor. Their monogram H+D was etched into walls, overlapping like a married couple's initials. It was Catherine who wore the crown, but Diane wore the power. She didn't just influence court politics, she embodied France's Renaissance femininity. Poised, but deadly. Graceful, but sharp. She surrounded herself with art, literature, and the finest minds of the time. She commissioned some of the era's most iconic works. She became an ideal, a living myth. And yet, her enemies called her a temptress, a vampire, a witch who drained youth from the king and wore time like silk. There was that one infamous painting, Gabrielle d'Este and her sister, often misattributed or confused in later centuries, in which two women sit in a bath, one casually pinching the other's nipple while holding a ring, a symbol of erotic power, female intimacy, and court rumor. Diane's name got wrapped into the gossip. Whether she's in that portrait or not, the message stuck. Diane represented desire as power and power as desire. She stayed in control for decades. Even as Henry's children grew, even as the kingdom shifted, Diane held court beside the king like a second queen. But even legends bleed. In 1559, Henry was injured in a jousting accident. A splintered lance pierced his eye. He died in agony, and with him, Diane's hold on the court collapsed. Catherine de Médicis sidelined and silently fuming seized her moment. She banished Diane from court, forced her to return all royal jewels, and erased her from official records. The woman who had once worn the sun now lived in a chateau surrounded by shadows. And yet, Diane de Poitiers never begged. She aged with grace, died at the age of 66, and was buried under a tomb that bore no crowningly a legacy. Why was Diane extreme? Because she held the heart of a king without ever asking for a title. She moved through scandal not like a victim, but like a force. Her body may have aged, but her myth never did. She proved that a woman could wield absolute power, not through armies, but through elegance, intelligence, and a single look that said, "You'll do what I want, and you'll think it was your idea." But what happens when a mistress not only captures a king's heart but bears his children, nearly becomes queen, and dies suddenly just before her coronation? Gabrielle d'Estrées. She wasn't born with a crown, but she came heartbreakingly close to wearing one. Gabrielle d'Estrées, the golden mistress of King Henry IV of France, lived her short life like a candle burning from both ends, brilliant, beautiful, and far too brief. Born in 1573 to a noble but not particularly wealthy family, Gabrielle entered the French court as a teenage beauty, barely past childhood. The court was a storm of religious wars, political assassinations, and dynastic chaos. And in the eye of that storm stood Henry of Navarre future, King Henry Va, Protestant warrior turned royal, whose charm was as famous as his appetite for women. He had many lovers, dozens in fact, but Gabrielle was different. They met when she was just 16. Henry was already in his 40s, twice married and twice broken by France's wars. He was weary, she was luminous. And the moment they met, it wasn't just infatuation, it was ignition. Gabrielle didn't just become his mistress, she became his right hand, his confidant, and unofficially his queen. This was no backroom affair. Henry flaunted her at court, even as he struggled to unite a fractured Catholic-Protestant France. He built her palaces, showered her with jewels, called her Ma Belle Gabrielle in public. She bore him 3 children, all of whom were legitimized, and lived openly by his side. She wore the royal colors, Saturday beside him at state events, wrote letters in his name, and perhaps most famously, wore a coronation ring he had gifted her. That wasn't symbolic, that was a promise. Henry wanted to marry her. The plan was treasonous in the eyes of many. She was a commoner, a mistress, a Catholic in a Protestant-scarred kingdom. Nobles hissed, the church recoiled. Diplomats warned of civil war. But Henry didn't care. He declared Gabrielle the future Queen of France. The outrage was volcanic. Political enemies accused her of witchcraft. They called her the woman who bewitched the king, claiming she used charms, potions, and seduction to make Henry abandon reason. They said she was too ambitious, too powerful, too fertile. She wasn't a mistress, they claimed she was a threat. And just when it seemed Henry would force France to accept her, fateo, something darker, intervened. In 1599, while heavily pregnant with their 4th child, Gabrielle suddenly fell ill. She began vomiting violently. Her skin turned gray. Her mouth foamed. Within hours, she was dead. The official diagnosis? Eclampsia, a complication of pregnancy. The court whispered something else. Poison. Gabrielle had been scheduled to be crowned queen that very month. Her death shattered Henry. He wept openly, locked himself away, refused visitors. For days, he could not be consoled. He buried her with royal honors in a Franciscan convent. No mistress before Hernan was ever mourned like a queen. And in the decades that followed, Gabrielle's legend only grew. The famous painting of her and her sister in a bath, with a nipple pinch that launched 1,000 interpretations, became the eternal image of her myth. Sensual, intimate, playful, and defiant. It was seen as symbolic of fertility, of sisterhood, of sexual power and scandal all in one. Why was Gabrielle d'Este as extreme? Because she came closer than any woman in French history to ascending from mistress to monarch. Because she bore a king's love, children, and ambitions, all while navigating the knives of a court that would rather see her dead than crowned. Because she didn't just captivate Henry IV, became part of his political vision, a living embodiment of the unity he sought between faiths, classes, and hearts. She was the almost queen. But as the French court mourned one mistress, turned legend, another rose to take her place, cleverer, craftier, and every bit as irresistible. She didn't just influence the king. She became the architect of an entire cultural era, Madame de Pompadour. She wasn't born into power, but she painted herself into its frame with the precision of a master artist. Madame de Pompadour wasn't just a royal mistress, she was an institution, an era, a force of culture and courtly manipulation wrapped in lace, powdered hair, and a sly, knowing smile. Born Jeanne Antoinette Poisson in 1721, yes, her last name literally means fish. She was never meant to be a royal anything. Her family was wealthy but common. Her father vanished under suspicious financial scandal, and her mother, sharp as glass, had one mission: turn her daughter into someone unforgettable. And it worked. Young Jeanne was groomed for the court from the cradle. She studied dance, music, painting, poetry. She memorized Voltaire. She read Enlightenment philosophy between piano lessons and portrait sittings. By the time she was 20, she was fluent in charm, devastating in conversation, and dressed like every day was a coronation. Then came the moment of destiny, a royal hunt in the forest of Senart. King Louis XV, shy, reserved, but terminally bored with politics, and perhaps even more bored with the women around him, spotted her in the crowd. Jeanne wore pink. Her carriage was exquisite. Her eyes locked onto his like she'd written the script herself. He invited her to court within weeks. Soon she was installed at Versailles under the glittering title of Marquise de Pompadour, the official maîtresse and titre-chef royal mistress, a job that came with palaces, titles, and enemies. Plenty of enemies. Nobles rolled their eyes. The queen gritted her teeth. Courtiers whispered, "The fish is swimming in the royal pond." But Madame de Pompadour did what she always did, smiled, bowed, and outmaneuvered them all. Now here's the twist. Her sexual relationship with Louis XV didn't last long. Some say just a few years. Others say even less. But that didn't matter, because Pompadour wasn't here just for pleasure. She was here for influence. She became the king's closest confidant, his political advisor, his interior decorator, his theater producer, his art curator, his emotional support strategist. She ran Versailles like a finely tuned machine. She knew every minister, every scandal, every diplomatic whisper. She read state papers, appointed key officials, and acted as the true north of Louis's court. If the king was the sun, Pompadour was gravity. And she changed France. She supported Enlightenment thinkers, Protecting controversial authors like Voltaire and Diderot, she championed the Encyclopédie, the very foundation of modern Western knowledge. She redesigned Versailles with Rococo flair, turning the palace into a living gallery of aesthetic seduction. She made pastels powerful. And yes, she had lovers, quiet ones. After her romance with Louis cooled, they were discreet, approved, and tolerated. Because even the king, especially the king, knew she was irreplaceable. But Pompadour's rise came at a cost. She battled constant illness, gallstones, depression, court cruelty. Every wrinkle was a threat, every birthday a countdown. She lived with the knowledge that her worth, in the eyes of many, was measured by youth and favor to things that wilted fast in Versailles' golden heat. Still, she endured. Until 1764, when she died at just 42. Louis was devastated. He wept. For once, Versailles fell quiet. Her tombstone reads, "Here lies the one who was the friend of the king." But she was so much more. Why was Madame de Pompadour extreme? Because she flipped the royal mistress role on its powdered head. She used charm not as seduction but as strategy. She turned gossip into armor. She shaped art, policy, and the very language of beauty for an entire generation. She proved that desire didn't have to burn out, it could evolve, refine, and reign. And as she left her delicate, perfumed fingerprint on history, another queen of France was rising, born royal, raised fierce, and ready to defy the crown itself with her heart, her body, and her battlefield of lovers. Marguerite of Valois. She was born in a palace, raised in a powder keg, and remembered in whispers, the kind of whispers that smell like incense and scandal. Marguerite of Valois, known to history as Queen Margot, was many things: a daughter of kings, a sister of queens, a wife of revolution, and a woman who turned love into both a sword and a shield. Born in 1553 to King Henry II of France and the formidable Catherine de' Medici, Marguerite's childhood wasn't just gilded, it was weaponized. She was a princess in name, but a pawn in practice. France in the 16th century was on fire with religious conflict. Catholics and Huguenots, French Protestants, were locked in bloody civil wars, and every marriage, every alliance, every glance was a move in the deadliest game on earth, politics by inheritance. Marguerite was beautiful, like legendary beautiful. Dark hair, piercing eyes, grace sculpted by etiquette and sharpened by her mother's ruthless ambition. And she was smart, multilingual, well-read, politically astute, too smart, really. Smart enough to know she was being primed for sacrifice. The marriage came in 1572. Marguerite was forced to wed Henry of Navarre, a Huguenot. The goal? Peace. The result? One of the most infamous massacres in European history. Just days after their wedding, on the 24th of August, Catholics began slaughtering Protestants in the streets of Paris. It was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Thousands died. Marguerite, newly married, was locked in her room while her husband barely escaped with his life. Her new marriage wasn't a honeymoon, it was a hostage situation. Henry was forced to convert to Catholicism, and Marguerite was forced to pretend none of it was her fault. But here's the thing about Queen Margot. She didn't break. She adapted. She stayed married to Henry, but she lived separately, took lovers, many lovers, military men, courtiers, scholars. Her romances weren't passive, they were political, personal, and public. And the French court, eternally obsessed with women's bodies, turned every whispered rumor into a dagger pointed at her back. She was called promiscuous, indecent, dangerous, and sometimes she leaned into it. Marguerite didn't just flirt, she orchestrated. Her palace was a salon of poetry, intrigue, and open sensuality. She dressed to provoke. She spoke with boldness. She carved out freedom in a world where women, especially queens, were supposed to remain porcelain and silent. Eventually, her sexual independence became too much for the court. In 1586, she was imprisoned in the Château d'Usson, exiled, forgotten, left to rot. Except she didn't. Marguerite transformed her exile into a second act. She hosted intellectuals, read voraciously, wrote her memoir, some of the first by a woman of her rank in Europe, and she waited. When her estranged husband Henry finally became king, Henry IV of France sought an annulment. Marguerite agreed, but not for nothing. She negotiated a generous settlement and retained her royal title. Then, in the grandest plot twist of all, she returned to Paris, not as a disgraced former queen, but as a grand lady of the court. She wore black and pearls, adopted orphans, supported the arts, hosted salons, was adored by the people. She outlived enemies, outlived gossip, outlived the expectations of what a queen should be. Why was Marguerite of Valois extreme? Because she refused to be defined by any man, not her king, not her lovers, not the historians who tried to reduce her to a scandal. She lived with fire in her heart and ink in her pen. Her passions weren't flaws, they were the rebellion of a woman who dared to feel everything out loud in a world that demanded silence. And speaking of women who are punished for feeling too much, what happens when a young bride becomes queen to a tyrant, then pays the ultimate price for loving before, during, and after the crown? Catherine Howard. Her name is short. Her reign was shorter. And yet the echo of Catherine Howard's story lingers like a whisper in the cold halls of Tudor history, whisper scented with roses, soaked in fear, and sharpened by betrayal. She was Henry VIII's fifth wife, a teenager with a smile too bright for court, and a fate too dark for fiction. The king, by then swollen with age, rotund with power, and desperate for youth, found in her not just beauty, but a second chance, or so he thought. Catherine was born around 1524 into the powerful but reckless Howard family, a clan of noble blood, high ambition, and dangerous proximity to the throne. She was raised in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, where supervision was more of a suggestion than a rule. The girls ran wild, the boys noticed. There, in a blur of adolescence and opportunity, Catherine experienced what history would later call inappropriate relationships. But in truth, these were more complicated. She was a child, navigating a court where desire and danger were indistinguishable, where power looked like a smile and often came in the form of a locked door. By her late teens, Catherine had already been groomed, flattered, possibly coerced, and then offered up to a king 3 decades her senior. Henry VIII, long past his days as the dashing prince, now limped from gout, haunted by paranoia and obsessed with securing an heir and a legacy. To him, Catherine was light. She giggled, danced, wore the latest fashion, spoke with flirtatious ease, and perhaps most importantly, she did not yet fear him. To Henry, she was the antidote to aging, the breath of youth that might redeem his twilight years. He called her his rose without a thorn. They married in 1540. She was likely around 17. He was nearing 50. But the rose had roots the king didn't know about, and thorns he would not forgive. Soon after their marriage, Catherine's past caught up with her, first whispered by jealous courtiers, then shouted by enemies. Evidence surfaced of her previous dalliances with Francis Derham, a former music tutor. Letters, gossip, witnesses. And then came the real dagger. Rumors that, even after marrying the king, she had taken a new lover, Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's chamber. Secret meetings, late-night rendezvous. A court lady's testimony. All of it pointed to one unthinkable word in a Tudor marriage: adultery. For a queen, it wasn't just scandal, it was treason. Henry, who had once torn apart a religion to divorce his first wife and behead his second, now faced his fifth wife's betrayal like a wounded beast. Heartbroken? Yes. Humiliated? Absolutely. But most of all, enraged. Catherine was arrested, stripped of her title, and imprisoned in her apartments. She was never granted a formal trial. She confessed, though under pressure, and was condemned. On the 13th of February, 1542, she was led to the Tower of London, pale and trembling. Legend says she asked for the block the night before to practice laying her head upon it. She was barely 19. Why was Catherine Howard extreme? Because she lived in a world that punished desire in women and rewarded it in men. She was young, unprotected, and thrust into a royal nightmare dressed in pearls. Her story is not one of calculated seduction, it's one of entrapment, of longing, and of the impossible expectations placed on women at court. Her body was a battlefield long before she ever wore a crown. And yet she dared to love, dared to remember what joy felt like, and for that, she died. But what if a queen took that risk not in secret, but in plain view, having a full-blown affair with her husband's doctor, while the entire kingdom watched the scandal unfold like a slow-motion coup? Caroline Mathilde of Great Britain. If royal scandal had a soundtrack, Caroline Mathilde's story would open with a soft piano and end in a crashing symphony of betrayal. She wasn't meant to be a headline, but by the time she was 23, her name was tattooed across the front page of every court diary from London to Copenhagen. A queen by accident, a rebel by passion, and a cautionary tale whispered in powdered corridors ever since. Born in 1751, Caroline Mathilde was the youngest daughter of Frederick, Prince of Wales, and a granddaughter of George II. Her childhood was unremarkable by royal standards. Books, tutors, embroidery, and the occasional glimpse into the rigid machinery of dynastic marriage. She probably thought she had time more than a few years at least before being shipped off to wed a distant cousin in a strange land. She didn't. At the age of 15, she was married off to her cousin, King Christian VII of Denmark and Norway. He was 17, charismatic in public, but behind closed doors, deeply troubled. Historians would later suggest schizophrenia or another form of severe mental illness, though back then he was simply labeled as erratic, unstable, or more bluntly mad. The marriage was doomed from the start. Christian was cold, detached, obsessed with prostitutes, and indifferent to his new bride. He surrounded himself with sycophants and jesters. He rarely visited her chambers. She gave birth to their son, the future King Frederick VI, but by then, the royal household was more prison than palace. Then came Johann Friedrich Struensee. A German physician hired to treat Christian's spiraling mental health, Struensee quickly became more than just a doctor. He became the king's shadow, whispering advice, controlling access, guiding decisions, and then, inevitably, stepping into the queen's room. Caroline was 18, intelligent, isolated, and starved for affection. Struensee was bold, reform-minded, dangerously handsome. Their connection was immediate, secretive, electric, and ultimately catastrophic. They didn't hide it well. He began spending nights in her quarters. Notes were exchanged. Glances lingered. And then against all common sense and survival instinct she bore him a child, Princess Louise Augusta, in 1771. The royal family smiled for the portraits, but behind the scenes Denmark was unraveling. And not just because of the affair. Struensee, acting through Christian, implemented sweeping Enlightenment reforms. He abolished torture, rewrote laws, slashed noble privileges. For a brief moment, Denmark felt modern, revolutionary, alive. But the old guard, the aristocracy, the clergy, the queen mother watched with growing rage. They didn't just see a physician sleeping with the queen. They saw a usurper, a revolution with a stethoscope. So they acted. In the dead of night, a coup was staged. Soldiers stormed the palace. Struensee was arrested. Caroline was separated from her children and taken away under armed guard. She was stripped of her titles, exiled to Celle in northern Germany, and never saw Denmark or her children again. Struensee? He was tried, tortured, and executed. Publicly, brutally. The Enlightenment, it seemed, had an expiration date. Caroline spent the rest of her short life in quiet seclusion. She died at the age of 23, likely from scarlet fever, but in those few years she had lived more boldly than most queens in a lifetime. Why was Caroline Mathilde extreme? Because she dared to find love in a world that offered her none. Because she didn't just suffer through a cold marriage, risked everything for a man who promised warmth. And because, for one fleeting moment, she helped steer a nation toward light before it plunged back into darkness. Her story is a cautionary tale wrapped in silk. But as we turn the page, we enter a world far darker, where scandal wasn't just whispered. It was weaponized. And one woman's name became synonymous with poison, incest, and whispered sin. A Borgia, a daughter of the Pope, a woman history could never quite forget, Lucrezia Borgia. Whispers followed her like perfume, poisoner, incestuous temptress, femme fatale in papal gold. Lucrezia Borgia was born into the most scandal-soaked family in Renaissance Italy, and somehow she managed to outscandal even them. She entered the world in 1480, the illegitimate daughter of Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, a Spanish-born cleric on the rise within the Vatican's corridors of velvet and vice. When Lucrezia was still a child, Rodrigo ascended to the throne of St. Peter as Pope Alexander VI, pope with more ambition than piety and more children than most monarchs dared acknowledge. And Lucrezia? She was his favorite. Raised in Roman splendor, Lucrezia was no cloistered maiden. She was educated like a prince, fluent in Latin, Greek, poetry, and diplomacy. While most girls were taught to sew, she was taught to survive, and with good reason. Because in the Borgia family, love was negotiable. Power was not. Her life became a parade of arranged marriages, each one a chess move orchestrated by her father and her brother Cesare Borgia, ruthless military commander with his own black legend. Lucrezia wasn't married off. She was deployed. Her first engagement was broken off after political tides shifted. Her second marriage, to Giovanni Sforza, ended in annulment. The reason given? Non-consummation. But that wasn't the juicy part. The rumors that followed said Sforza was dismissed because the Borgia men wanted Lucrezia for themselves. Yes, the I word. Incest. Whispers claimed she was sleeping with her father, with her brother, or with both. These claims were repeated so often, so breathlessly, that they became gospel in the gossipy echo chambers of Europe. But historians still argue, was it true? Or was it the most elaborate smear campaign of the Renaissance? Because here's the thing, Lucrezia wasn't a puppet, she was a player. After Sforza, she was married off again to Alfonso of Aragon. This one, at least, began with some affection. But then politics got in the way. The alliance soured. Cesare, ever the enforcer, had Alfonso assassinated. Lucrezia was left a widow again, according to some sources, pregnant with his child. She was barely 20. Then came marriage number 3, Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara. A noble match, a lifeline away from Rome's toxic courts. And here, finally, Lucrezia began to step out from her family's shadow. She became Duchess of Ferrara, and here's the twist, she was good at it. She ruled capably in her husband's absence, hosted scholars, artists, and philosophers, corresponded with poets, founded charities, built libraries. She transformed Ferrara into a beacon of Renaissance culture. The same woman accused of poisoning her enemies was now curating beauty, justice, and light. But the past never really let go. Despite her political power and public rehabilitation, Lucrezia's reputation clung to her like cobwebs. Every illness at court was blamed on her. Every death, a whispered Borgia work. Even her jewelry, like the rumored hollow ring used to slip poison into a rival's drink, became part of the myth. And maybe, just maybe, she let some of those rumors live. Because fear, after all, is a kind of power too. She died in 1519, at the age of 39, after complications from childbirth. Her final years were marked by sorrow-multiple miscarriages, the death of children, and the weight of a world that never saw her as anything but a sinner in silk. Why was Lucrezia Borgia extreme? Because she was born into corruption and survived it. Because she was used, then accused, and still carved out a legacy beyond the rumors. Because she turned her father's empire of sin into a platform for influence, beauty, and subtle rebellion. Whether she was the devil's daughter or just his most clever victim, Lucrezia rewrote her story with every breath. And if you thought court intrigue couldn't get any messier, wait until you meet the Swedish queen who fled her own crown, defied every gender rule in the book, and left behind a trail of broken hearts and existential crises from Stockholm to Rome. Christina, Queen of Sweden. If monarchy was a script, Queen Christina of Sweden ripped hers up, rewrote it in Latin, and performed it on horseback in men's clothing while quoting Descartes. Born in 1626 to a nation shaped by warfare and Protestant fire, Christina was supposed to be a king. Literally, her father, Gustavus Adolphus, called her his son and raised her like one. She was crowned queen, but trained to rule like a warrior prince. And for a while, she did. Sweden under Christina was one of the most powerful Protestant nations in Europe. She took the throne at 6 when her father died in battle, but didn't officially rule until her late teens. Once she did, she shocked her court with everything about her. Her refusal to marry, her love of learning, her androgynous dress, her razor-sharp tongue, her utter disdain for the script she'd been handed. Christina surrounded herself with philosophers, artists, scientists. She imported culture like other monarchs imported gold. Her court in Stockholm became a northern sanctuary of the Enlightenment. She invited thinkers like René Descartes, that Descartes Sweden, to tutor her personally. He died shortly after arriving. Swedish winters were not kind to Frenchmen. She devoured books, wrote essays, studied everything from theology to anatomy. And while most of Europe expected queens to act as soft power and quiet grace, Christina charged through tradition like a bull in a library. And that was before the rumors started. She refused to marry, ever. Rejected dozens of noble suitors. Claimed she had no interest in being chained to a man. and often said that ruling was her true spouse. She favored female companions, one in particular, Countess Ebba Spare, who she called her bedfellow and beloved. Their letters were breathless, intimate, filled with longing. Was it romantic? Platonic? Erotic? The court certainly thought so. But Christina didn't stop at challenging sexuality. She challenged religion. After ruling a fiercely Protestant kingdom for decades, she stunned the world by abdicating the throne in 1654. She gave it all up, her crown, her country, her identity, and fled to Rome. There, she converted to Catholicism, publicly, dramatically. Imagine it, a Protestant queen turned Catholic in the heart of the Vatican. A woman raised to fight the papacy, now kneeling before the Pope. The scandal was volcanic. Her country saw it as betrayal. The Catholic Church saw it as proof of divine victory. And Christina? She saw it as freedom. In Rome, she became a living enigma. She held salons with cardinals and philosophers, wore men's clothing often, lived alone, wrote volumes, sponsored artists, continued to reject every norm expected of a woman, especially one born to rule. She considered becoming a nun. She considered leading an army. She once proposed governing Naples. She fought duels. She wrote plays. She refused to die quietly. Christina lived a long life, nearly 70 years, with no husband, no children, and no regrets. Why was Christina extreme? Because she didn't just bend the rules of womanhood, she smashed them into powder. Because she walked away from ultimate power not in disgrace, but in philosophical triumph. Because she dared to live as a whole person in a time when women weren't even seen as whole citizens. She was brilliant, erratic, magnetic, maddening, a queen who was called a king, a lover whose gendered boundaries were blurred on purpose, a mind too large for one throne, one country, one story. And as her silhouette fades into the candlelit salons of Rome, another queen steps forward from the shadows. This one didn't defy the king she destroyed him. With a lover at her side and a crown in her eye, she broke England's heart and took the crown for her son, Isabella of France. They called her the she-wolf of France, and not because of her fur-trimmed gowns. No, Isabella earned that title the old-fashioned way, by marrying a king, plotting his downfall, taking a lover, launching a rebellion, and redefining what it meant to be a medieval queen. Born in 1295, the daughter of King Philip IV of France, Isabella was raised in a royal court where diplomacy was war and marriage was the sharpest weapon. At the age of 12, she was betrothed to England's young king, Edward II. The union was meant to seal peace between France and England. What it actually sealed was Isabella's front-row seat to one of the most chaotic and humiliating reigns in English history. Edward was handsome, athletic, and utterly captivated not by his wife, but by his male favorite, Piers Gaveston. The two were inseparable. Lavish gifts, intimate letters, public displays that shocked and scandalized the court. Gaveston wielded more influence than half the nobles combined, and Isabella? She was sidelined, humiliated, ignored. And she noticed. She gave Edward sons, including the future Edward III. She performed her royal duties with grace, but behind her courtly smile, the queen was plotting, watching, waiting. When Gaveston was finally executed by angry barons in 1312, Isabella's status briefly improved, but Edward, never one to learn from disaster, found a new obsession, Hugh Despenser the Younger. If Gaveston was a bad influence, Despenser was a national crisis. The Despenser's father and sons sank their claws into the king and drained the court like leeches. They seized land, imprisoned rivals, executed nobles, England spiraled into tyranny. And Isabella, once again, was pushed aside. Even her lands and income were stripped. She was publicly insulted, politically neutered, and left without protection. And that was Edward's mistake. Because Isabella was not a pawn. She was a queen, a daughter of France, and she was done playing the obedient wife. In 1325, Isabella traveled to France under the pretext of negotiating peace. There, she made her real move. She refused to return to England and, more importantly, she took a lover, Roger Mortimer, a powerful, exiled English noble with a grudge and an army. Together, Isabella and Mortimer assembled an invasion force, and in 1326 they landed in England to a hero's welcome. Edward's government crumbled like a bad soufflé. Nobles defected. Towns opened their gates. Isabella marched through her husband's kingdom not as a rebel, but as a savior. Edward and the Despensers fled. They were captured. The Despensers were executed in gruesome fashion. Edward himself was forced to abdicate in favor of his son, Edward III, and was later imprisoned and likely murdered under mysterious circumstances. Theories of red-hot pokers and prison conspiracies only added to the legend. Isabella and Mortimer ruled as regents for the young king, but power, as always, breeds enemies. Within a few years, Mortimer grew arrogant. Edward III came of age, and the young king turned on them. Mortimer was arrested and executed. Isabella, spared due to her royal blood and political tact, was placed under house arrest but lived out her days in comfort and dignity. Why was Isabella of France extreme? Because she turned from queen consort to queen commander. Because she dared to love who she chose, seize power from a disastrous king, and rewrite her fate in a time when women were expected to smile, obey, and suffer in silence. Isabella made her pain political. Her humiliation, a strategy. Her betrayal, a revolution. And she wasn't the last woman to rule from behind a curtain of whispers. Now shift your eyes east, to the dragon throne of Chinaware. Another empress, cloaked in silk and silence, ruled through puppet emperors, manipulated an empire, and stirred rumors of lovers in the palace shadows. Empress Cixi. In the history of China steeped in dynasties, rituals, and rigid rules, few figures loom as large, or as enigmatically, as Empress Dowager Cixi. She never sat on the dragon throne. She never held the title of emperor. And yet, for nearly half a century, Cixi ruled the Qing Empire from behind a silk screen, steering its fate with the precision of a puppeteer and the patience of a serpent coiled beneath brocade. She was born in 1835 to a low-ranking Manchu official, not royal, not destined. Just another girl in a sprawling empire. But at 16, she entered the Forbidden City as a concubine to Emperor Xianfeng, one among dozens, maybe hundreds. Nothing about her suggested power, until she gave birth to a son. In the imperial court, motherhood was currency, and Cixi had just minted herself a future emperor. When Xianfeng died in 1861, their son, just 5 years old, ascended as the Tongji Emperor, too young to rule, so a regency was formed. But Cixi, alongside the senior Empress Dowager Xian, orchestrated a coup. She forged alliances, seized the imperial seal, and outmaneuvered her rivals with ruthless brilliance. By the time the dust settled, Cixi wasn't just regent, she was the hidden sovereign of China. She ruled from behind a curtain during state councils, literally concealed by a screen as male officials bowed and groveled. They spoke to the boy emperor, but everyone knew who was really listening. And she didn't stop there. When Tongji died, young some say from smallpox, others from hedonistic self-destruction, Cixi broke tradition. She placed her 3-year-old nephew on the throne instead of a more senior candidate. Why? Because a toddler was easier to control. She would rule again and again. Cixi's reign was defined by contradiction. She was conservative and progressive, vicious and visionary. She crushed rebellions with merciless efficiency, yet poured resources into art, architecture, and modern military reform. She allowed railways, telegraphs, factories Western tools for an ancient empire. But her court was not without whispers. She surrounded herself with eunuchs and hand-picked attendants. Her favorite? The eunuch, Li Lianying, who wielded more power than some ministers. He was feared, worshipped, and said to be her confidant in everything. Some whispered their relationship was more than platonic, despite his castration. Others believed she had male lovers brought secretly into the palace under cover of night. Of course, none of this was written down. It couldn't be. But rumors floated through the streets of Beijing like incense smoke, that she held orgies in hidden chambers, that male actors and dancers served dual roles as entertainers and consorts, that she used her position to satiate not just her thirst for power but for pleasure. Truth, fiction, it almost doesn't matter. The sheer presence of the rumors is telling. Cixi was a woman in a man's world, ruling with a hand unseen and unrelenting. And for centuries, when women wield power, history so often responds with stories of sex, madness, and manipulation. With Cixi, it gave us all three. She ruled until her death in 1908, her final act, allegedly ordering the poisoning of the Guangxu emperor, her own nephew, just before she died, to ensure he wouldn't undo her legacy. Why was Empress Cixi extreme? Because she reigned over the largest empire on earth from behind a veil of tradition, with a mind sharper than any blade in the palace. Because she turned concubinage into command. Because she embraced the art of silence, then used it to drown her enemies. And whether or not she shared her bed with lovers or ghosts, her name lives as the woman who turned the Forbidden City into her fortress. And now, from the opulence of Qing China, we travel to the misty, blood-soaked plains of ancient Britain, where a queen once rose from ashes, rallied a nation, and led an empire into war, armed with nothing but rage, vengeance, and an iron will sharpened by Roman cruelty. Boudica. When history says a woman is too angry, pay attention. It usually means she was powerful, and in Boudica's case, it meant she was a storm in bronze. A queen, a widow, a mother, and the leader of one of the most explosive uprisings the Roman Empire ever faced. No silks, no perfumes, just war, paint, iron, and vengeance. She wasn't born into luxury. Boudica was queen of the Iceni, a Celtic tribe in ancient Britain, around the 1st century CE. She lived in a time when Rome was spreading like wildfire across the known world, torching local cultures, absorbing kings, and redrawing borders without asking permission. The Iceni, for a while, played along. Boudica's husband, King Prasutagus, struck a deal with Rome. He ruled as a client, king autonomous, sort of, as long as he paid tribute. And when he died, he thought he was clever. He left his kingdom jointly to his daughters and to the Roman emperor, hoping to protect his family. Rome didn't care. They ignored the will, took the kingdom, pillaged the land, and then they made it personal. They publicly flogged Boudica, stripped her before a crowd, whipped her for defiance, and then they raped her daughters. That's how you create a rebellion. Boudica didn't break. She roared. She gathered the tribes, the Trinovantes, the Cornovii, others who had watched their people trampled and their gods erased. She painted her skin with woad, mounted her chariot, and swore vengeance just for herself, not just for her daughters, but for an entire island crushed beneath Roman sandals. And she delivered it. In 60 or 61 CE, she launched one of the most successful revolts in Roman Britain. Her forces were fierce, fast, and brutal. They razed Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester, burning the Roman capital to ash. Then they moved on to Londinium, London, and Verulamium, St. Albans, destroying everything. No fortress too sacred, no Roman too protected. The death toll, tens of thousands. They say the streets ran red. They say the sky darkened with smoke. They say Rome, for the first time in a long time, looked over its shoulder in fear. Boudica was more than a warrior. She was a symbol. Her speeches stirred warriors into frenzy. Her chariot, flanked by her daughters, cut through the battlefield like a blade through silk. She didn't wear a crown. She wore fury, and for a moment she almost toppled the untoppleable empire. But Rome adapted. Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus regrouped. He baited the rebels into open battle. Roman discipline met Celtic chaos. Superior tactics, training, and armor began to turn the tide. The final battle location, still debated, was a slaughter. Boudica's forces were defeated, her rebellion crushed. And then, silence. The records diverge. Some say she poisoned herself rather than be captured. Others claim she fell sick and died. The truth is uncertain. But what's clear is that Boudica vanished into legend the same way she charged into battle wild, unapologetic and unforgettable. Why was Boudica extreme? Because she didn't rise to power through titles, treaties, or bedsheets. She rose through fire, through fury. She became a queen, not of court, but of carnage. A woman who watched Rome hurt her children and responded by burning their cities to the ground. She wasn't a lover. She wasn't a mistress. She was something far more terrifying, a woman with nothing left to lose and a nation willing to follow her into hell. And while some queens used their allure to influence the powerful, the next one ruled from a desert throne with mystery in her eyes, a god-king by her side, and a beauty so legendary that some claim she never died at all, Zenobia. She wore a crown in a world where that wasn't supposed to happen, not as a wife, not as a regent, but as a ruler, absolute, defiant, and dazzling. Zenobia of Palmyra didn't inherit power quietly. She seized it with poise and precision, carved out her own empire from Rome's ribcage, and made herself a legend before the dust of history even had time to settle. Born in the 3rd century CE in Palmyra, city of marble columns and desert winds, Zenobia was educated in multiple languages, fluent in Greek, Latin, Aramaic, and Egyptian. She studied philosophy, read Homer, memorized political texts, and all of this before she ever wore a crown. Because Zenobia wasn't raised to be a silent consort. She was raised to think, to lead, to scheme. She married Odaenathus, the ruler of Palmyra, who had earned favor with the Roman Empire by protecting its eastern provinces from the chaos of Persian invasions. For a time, Palmyra was a loyal Roman ally. But Rome, during this century, was unraveling. Civil wars, power vacuums, emperors rising and falling like dominoes. The empire was weak. And Zenobia, she was watching. When Odaenathus was assassinated along with his eldest son from a previous marriage, Zenobia stepped into the power void. She declared her young son Vabilathus the rightful ruler, but make no mistake, she was the one in charge. She didn't waste time. Within a year, Zenobia had expanded her control far beyond the borders of Palmyra, Syria, Judea, Arabia, Egypt, yes, Egypt, the jewel of the Roman East, the breadbasket of the empire. She took it, not by accident, not by rebellion, but by claiming she had divine authority, that she descended from Cleopatra herself, that she was born to rule. And just like that, the desert queen became an empress. But unlike Cleopatra, Zenobia didn't need Roman lovers to climb the throne. She didn't seduce emperors. She didn't plead for alliances. She marched armies. She built cities. She issued coins with her own face and her son's. She stood before generals and philosophers as their equaler, their superior. She styled herself Augusta, a title reserved for empresses of Rome. Rome didn't like that. The Emperor Aurelian, no stranger to civil unrest, couldn't ignore her. In 272 CE, he launched a full-scale campaign to bring Zenobia down. But this wasn't a swift victory. Zenobia made him fight for every inch. Her armies, led by brilliant generals, defended territory with surgical efficiency. Her empire stretched from the Euphrates to the Nilea, stretch no woman had ruled in centuries. But in the end, Rome was Rome. Aurelian crushed her forces near Antioch and Emesa. Zenobia fled reportedly on a camel at breakneck speed, hoping to reach Persia and regroup. But she was captured on the banks of the Euphrates, brought back to Rome in chains. And then the story bends. According to some accounts, she was paraded through the streets of Rome in golden shackles during Aurelian's triumph. Others claim she was treated with respect, allowed to live out her days in comfort as a Roman noblewoman. A few whisper she took her own life rather than suffer humiliation. No one knows for sure. What we do know is this: Zenobia carved out an empire in a time of chaos. She challenged the greatest military machine in history and very nearly won. And she did it not by playing Rome's game, but by rewriting the rules. Why was Zenobia extreme? Because she was everything a woman wasn't supposed to be in the ancient world: militant, ambitious, self-proclaimed sovereign. Because she didn't flirt her way to power, she forged it with steel and intellect. Because she dared to look at the Roman Empire and say, "This far and no further." And now, as Zenobia's echoes fade into the sands, another Egyptian queen emerges not with an army, but with an image so perfect, so enduring, she became immortal in art, mystery, and obsession. Was she a co-ruler, a goddess, or something far more complicated? Nefertiti. She's the face that launched 1,000 replicas. The limestone bust, impossibly smooth and serene, sits under glass in Berlin, gazing sideways as if she knows something we never will. Nefertiti, whose name means "the beautiful one has come," is both the most recognizable and the most unknowable queen of ancient Egypt. A paradox in paint, a mystery in stone. She ruled alongside Akhenaten in the 14th century BCE, during one of Egypt's strangest and most radical periods. He wasn't your typical pharaoh. He changed the religion, abandoned the gods of centuries, declared the sun disk Aten as the sole deity, moved the capital to a new city, Akhetaten, worshipped light over darkness, minimalism over ritual. And beside him, not just as a decorative figure, but as co-ruler, stood Nefertiti. She wasn't a passive consort. In the carved reliefs of the time, she appears not in the shadows, but front and center, wearing the blue crown usually reserved for kings, smiting enemies, leading worship. She wasn't standing behind the throne, she was sharing it. Which begs the question, who was she really? We don't know her origins for certain. She might have been Egyptian nobility. She might have been foreign-born. Her lineage is debated, her childhood a blank slate. But once she stepped onto history's stage, she didn't just stand there. She posed, she reigned, she dazzled. The records, what few haven't been erased, show her as a queen of immense influence. She had 6 daughters. She presided over religious ceremonies. She was Akhenaten's equal in devotion to the Aten, the sun god. Together, they created a cult of divine light, positioning themselves as the earthly manifestations of the sun's will. Their rule blurred the line between spirituality and spectacle. But behind that bright surface, something was shifting. By the end of Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti vanishes from official records, just gone. Her name scrubbed from temple walls, her titles replaced, her likeness erased. Did she fall from favor? Die young? Or more intriguingly, did she become something more? Some scholars suggest Nefertiti may have re-emerged under a different name, Smenkhkare, a mysterious figure who briefly ruled Egypt after Akhenaten's death, possibly as a male pharaoh. Was it her, disguised as a man to hold the crumbling empire together? It's not confirmed, but the theory has fire, and like all great mysteries, it only adds to her legend. Her beauty is immortalized in the iconic bust discovered in 1912: high cheekbones, long neck, symmetrical perfection, no inscriptions, no scars, just elegance suspended in time. But don't let that frozen grace fool you, because Nefertiti was not simply a pretty face. She was a radical, a ruler in an age of upheaval, a queen who stood beside one of Egypt's most controversial pharaohs as he upended centuries of religion, politics, and power. And she didn't just support it, she led it. And maybe, just maybe, when the backlash came, when priests revolted, when old gods rose again, when the kingdom slipped back into the hands of the traditional elitesh slipped away, not as a failure, but as a woman who had dared to reimagine Egypt. Why was Nefertiti extreme? Because she challenged the role of queen and goddess at the same time. Because she fused politics with divinity, beauty with dominance. Because whether she died, transformed, or ruled in disguise, she left behind more questions than answers and made sure her name, or at least her image, would never be forgotten. And as her legacy shines under museum lights, another pharaoh, this one female from the beginning, steps forward from deeper in the sands. She didn't share power. She took it. She didn't claim the title of queen. She claimed the crown of kings. Hatshepsut. She wore the beard of a king, not because she had to, but because she wanted the throne to take her seriously. Hatshepsut, one of ancient Egypt's most successful pharaohs, didn't wait for permission. She didn't rule beside a man. She didn't act from the shadows. She stood on the sun-scorched steps of Karnak Temple, declared herself pharaoh, and dared the world to argue. Born around 1507 BCE to Pharaoh Thutmose I and his principal wife Hatshepsut, was royal by blood and poised for high status. As was customary, she was married off to her half-brother, Thutmose II. Royal family trees in Egypt weren't just tangled, they were circles. But even as a queen consort, Hatshepsut wasn't content with ceremonial duties and background roles. She was politically active, religiously devout, and strategically visible. When Thutmose II died, his son by a secondary wife, Thutmose III, was technically heir. Problem was, he was a child. So Hatshepsut became regent, at first, temporarily, just until the boy came of age. But Hatshepsut had other plans. Within a few years, she elevated herself from regent to pharaoh, not queen, not dowager. Pharaoh, ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt, wearer of the double crown. She adopted all the iconography of kingship, the uraeus cobra, the Nemes headdress, and yes, the ceremonial beard. Her statues showed her as male, her inscriptions used masculine pronouns. But don't be fooled, this wasn't self-erasure, it was strategy. The role of pharaoh was masculine by design, and Hatshepsut was rewriting the script from the inside. She didn't become a man. She became a new kind of woman, one who could rule in a man's world without apology. And she did more than rule. She thrived. Her reign was a time of peace, prosperity, and architectural ambition. She launched massive building projects, the most famous being her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, an architectural marvel carved into the cliffs, terraced like a celestial staircase. She opened trade routes, most notably to the land of Punt, bringing back gold, ivory, myrrh trees, and exotic animals. Her policies stabilized the economy. Her temples reasserted religious orthodoxy, while subtly reinforcing her divine right to rule. She wasn't a warrior pharaoh like Ramesses. She didn't need to be. Her reign was one of wealth, not conquest, of elegance, not excess, but power. Oh, she had plenty of that. Of course, not everyone approved. After her death, likely from illness around her 50s, something strange happened. Her name was erased from many official records. Her statues were smashed. Her images chiseled off temple walls. For centuries, Egypt tried to forget her. The erasure was likely orchestrated by Thutmose III, who had finally taken full power after her death. Whether it was revenge, politics, or simply an effort to restore the proper male lineage of pharaohs, it worked. For thousands of years, Hatshepsut's legacy was buried until modern archaeologists pieced her story back together from the fragments. Why was Hatshepsut extreme? Because she didn't wait for power to be given. She took it. Because she redefined leadership in one of the most patriarchal civilizations in history and made it look effortless. Because she used performance, imagery, and intellect to construct a persona so formidable that even time tried to bury it. She wasn't just a female pharaoh. She was the female pharaoh, the blueprint, the outlier. The queen who wore kingship like linen and gold and ruled an empire not with seduction, but with sheer, unshakable will. And while Hatshepsut's name was nearly lost to the sands, the next Roman noblewoman's name has been whispered ever since, married to a tyrant, remembered for her ambition, and blamed for a seduction that may have ended an empire. Poppaea Sabina. In a city that ran on whispers, Poppaea Sabina was a scream. Silver-haired and venom-laced, she was the second wife of the Emperor Nero, and depending on who you ask, she was either a master manipulator or the most unfortunate muse in Roman history. Either way, when Poppaea walked into a room, power followed, or burned. Born around 30 CE to an aristocratic Roman family, Poppaea wasn't just beautiful, she was terrifyingly strategic. From a young age, she understood the theater of Roman society. The togas, the toasts, the gossip passed like daggers from ear to ear. She knew that being attractive wasn't enough. You had to be unforgettable, irresistible, inevitable. And she was. Before she ever set eyes on Nero, she had already been married twice. Her second husband was Otho, handsome, charming, politically promising, the perfect springboard. Through Otho, she gained proximity to the imperial court. But she didn't just want to orbit power, she wanted to become its axis. Enter Nero. The emperor was still young, volatile, self-obsessed, musically delusional, but Poppaea knew how to play him. She flattered his art, endorsed his narcissism, stoked his cruelty just enough to excite him. She slipped into his life like a siren song wrapped in silk, and he fell hard. The problem? Nero was married to Octavia, the daughter of Emperor Claudius. Octavia was popular, modest, and tragically dull in comparison. But divorce wasn't easy, especially with public opinion clinging to Octavia like armor. So Poppaea did what ambitious women in Rome had to do. She sowed seeds, whispers of infidelity, slander, cold manipulation dressed as concern. Nero eventually exiled Octavia, then executed her. Allegedly, after a staged reconciliation just to keep Poppaea happy. And then, finally, Poppaea Sabina became empress. She wasn't a shadow ruler, she was a queen in every public sense. Her face was carved into coins, her style imitated by noble women across the empire. She hosted diplomatic events, spoke with senators, and shaped imperial image. She wore pearls like armor and scented her skin with rose water so thick it was said entire fields bloomed to keep her supplied. But she wasn't just a fashion icon. Poppaea wielded real influence. She encouraged Nero's artistic ambitions, his brutal crackdowns, his increasingly erratic policies. Was she a handler, a manipulator, a co-conspirator? Or just someone smart enough to survive a dangerous man? It depends who you ask. Roman historians, especially Tacitus and Suetonius, loathed her. They painted her as poison in human form. They claimed she used her beauty like a dagger, drove Nero to murder, and ruled through seduction and deceit. But Roman historians also had a pattern of vilifying powerful women, especially ones who didn't stay silent. What's not up for debate is her end. In 65 CE, Poppaea died while pregnant with Nero's child. The official version? A miscarriage. The whispered version? Nero, in a fit of rage, kicked her in the stomach. A brutal, sudden, tragic end to a woman who had played Rome's deadliest game and almost won. Nero wept. For once, he wept. He built a temple in her honor, had her embalmed with spices fit for a goddess, declared her divine. But no amount of mourning could cleanse the story. Why was Poppaea Sabina extreme? Because she didn't just seduce an emperor, she directed him. Because she blurred the line between desire and destruction. Because she understood Rome's greatest secret. Power doesn't come from the Senate or the sword. It comes from the person the emperor listens to when the doors are closed and the lights are low. And speaking of legacies built on scandal and exile, the next woman on our list was born a daughter of the first Roman emperor and died alone on an island, stripped of her title after a life defined by rebellion, romance, and rumors. Julia the Elder. She was born into a world where her name alone could shake the marble columns of Rome. Julia, the elder-only daughter of Augustus, the first emperor, wasn't just royalty. She was Rome's living emblem, its first imperial princess, its golden child. But in a city obsessed with control, what happens when the perfect daughter refuses to play by the rules? The answer? Scandal, exile, and a legacy so steeped in double standards that it still smells faintly of hypocrisy 2,000 years later. Julia was born in 39 BCE, the only biological child of Augustus and his second wife, Scribonia. On the very day she was born, Augustus divorced her mother. That tells you everything you need to know about how tightly Augustus clung to image and legacy. Julia wasn't just a daughter, she was political capital. She was raised in the most scrutinized household in the empire, educated to be intelligent but obedient, charming but chaste, visible but never defiant. Augustus used her like a keystone in his architectural plan for dynastic immortality. She was married off like a treaty. Her first husband? Marcellus, her cousin, and Augustus's likely heir. He died young. Her second, Marcus Agrippa, Augustus's right-hand man, nearly twice her age. This one lasted. Julia bore him 5 children, 3 sons, 2 daughters, many of whom were groomed as future heirs to the empire. She did her duty. She smiled for the statues. She paraded in virtue. And yet, behind the scenes, Rome whispered. They whispered that Julia was too witty, too social, too beautiful, that her evenings were lively, that the men around her didn't stay indifferent for long. By the time Agrippa died, and Augustus forced Julia to marry her own stepbrother, Tiberius, a marriage neither of them wanted, the rumors had turned into wildfire. Rome expected its women, especially imperial women, to be paragons of modesty. But Julia didn't want to be a statue. She wanted to live. She hosted salons filled with poets and philosophers. She drank. She laughed too loudly. She took lovers, allegedly many, some of them high-ranking Romans. According to Suetonius, she used the very spots where her father had posted signs about moral reform as places to meet her lovers. Whether or not that's true, the story is soaked in irony. Augustus had built his reign on the myth of Roman morality. He'd enacted laws punishing adultery, exiling women who stepped out of line, and then his own daughter, his carefully polished heirloom, defied him. The reaction was brutal. In 2 BCE, Julia was arrested and charged with adultery and un-Roman conduct. But this wasn't a quiet scandal. It was a political execution in slow motion. Augustus exiled her to the barren island of Pandateria, modern-day Ventotene. No husband, no children, no visitors. She was cut off from society, left to rot on the rocky coast, the imperial shame cloaked in velvet silence. Even after Augustus died, her fate didn't improve. Tiberius, now emperor, and still bitter from their forced marriage, kept her in exile, cut her stipend, let her starve. She died alone in 14 CE, the same year he took the throne. Why was Julia the Elder extreme? Because she tried to live as a free woman in a society that demanded submission from its most visible daughters. Because she turned court life into a stage and played her own part instead of the one scripted for her. Because she became the first example of Rome's greatest contradiction, celebrating female lineage while punishing female agency. And as Julia's laughter fades from Rome's palaces, we travel south to a very different court caliphate, where one woman wrote poems as bold as her politics, ran a salon of lovers and rebels, and lived life as unapologetically as any queen with a crown. Wallada bint al-Mustakfi. She wore no veil. She embroidered her poetry onto her robes. She opened her palace to poets, lovers, and dreamers alike, and closed it to any expectation of obedience. Wallada bint al-Mustakfi wasn't a queen by crown or coronation. She was royalty by rebellion, a Caliphal daughter of Al-Andalus who lived like a monarch in exile and loved like a flame in the dark. Born around 994 CE in Cordoba, Wallada was the daughter of the Caliph Muhammad III of the Umayyad dynasty. Her father's reign was short and chaotic, ending in political collapse and exile. The caliphate itself was unraveling. Her family's palace crumbled into history, and with it, Wallada's official claim to power. But she didn't vanish. She stepped forward. Wallada refused to be a footnote in a male-dominated age. She inherited wealth from her family and used it to establish her own literary salon, unheard of for a woman, especially in Islamic Spain at the time. Her gatherings were legendary. Poets, philosophers, artists, and politicians gathered in her home to debate, perform, and sometimes fall in love. Wallada was more than just a host. She was the center of gravity. Her intellect matched her beauty. Her Her wit was edged with fire. She challenged gender roles not by accident, but by design. She wore clothing that shocked the court robes, bearing verses of her own erotic poetry stitched into the fabric, such as, "I am made for greatness, and by God I walk proudly." And then came Ibn Zaydun, the most famous love affair in Al-Andalus. Ibn Zaydun, a celebrated poet of the time, fell hard for Wallada. Their relationship was volcaniscintimate, passionate, and eventually disastrous. He praised her in verses that still echo through Arabic literature, calling her radiant, untouchable, celestial. But something went wrong. Some say he betrayed her with a servant, others believe it was political rivalry or jealousy. Either way, Wallada cut him loose with all the fury of a queen betrayed. And then she did what most women of her time could not, she wrote about it. Her poetry turned personal heartbreak into public statement. She penned biting, sensual, defiant verses that declared her autonomy over her body, her mind, her name. She mocked him in meter, dared him to respond, and in doing so, carved out space for women's voices in a literary tradition dominated by men. But Wallada wasn't just a romantic figure, she was a political one. She lived in a Cordoba torn apart by civil war, dynastic decline, and shifting empires. Though she never held political office, her salon was a hub of ideological resistance. She supported reformist poets, sheltered thinkers, challenged orthodoxy with every verse she recited in public. And while many women of her time were cloistered, silenced, or married off, Wallada lived alone, unmarried, in full command of her choices. That, perhaps, was the greatest scandal of all. She died around 1091 as the city of Cordoba fell to the Almoravids. Her tomb still stands quiet now, unlike the firebrand who once turned its city into her personal court. Why was Wallada bint al-Mustakfi extreme? Because she defied the boundaries of gender, politics, and literature all at once. Because she dared to live not behind a veil of modesty, but in the spotlight of radical honesty. Because she made her name not through marriage or inheritance, but through verse, vision, and voice. She was never queen in title, but she ruled hearts, salons, and centuries of Arabic literature with an iron quill and a silver tongue. And from the lantern-lit salons of Cordoba, we now move to revolutionary Paris, where the first Empress of France navigated war, empire, and the whims of a man named Napoleon while carrying the echoes of her scandalous past like perfume through the halls of Versailles. Empress Joséphine Bonaparte. Before she was an empress, she was a prisoner. Before she was a prisoner, she was a socialite. And before she was a socialite, she was just Marie Joseph Rose Tascher de la Pagerie, a Creole girl born on a sugar plantation in Martinique. But the world would come to know her by a different name, Joséphine. And the man who put a crown on her head? Napoleon Bonaparte. But this isn't his story. It's hers. Born in 1763, Joséphine came from noble but financially strained stock. Her family sent her to France to marry the intended suitor of her sister, who inconveniently died before the wedding. So Joséphine stepped in, married Alexandre de Beauharnais, and stepped into the whirlwind of pre-revolutionary French aristocracy. It wasn't a happy marriage. Her husband was unfaithful, distant, and politically ambitious, but Joséphine adapted. She had 2 children, including Eugene, who would go on to be a trusted stepson to Napoleon. When the French Revolution came clawing, her husband, now aligned with the Girondins, was swept up in the purge. He was guillotined in 1794 during the Reign of Terror. Joséphine, too, was arrested, imprisoned, awaiting the blade. But luck or something like it intervened. Robespierre fell. Joséphine walked free and into the arms of a very different future. She emerged into post-terror Paris as something entirely new, a widow, a survivor, and a woman with enough social cunning to stay afloat in the blood-stained wreckage of the old aristocracy. Her circle included artists, courtiers, and powerful men. She wore scandal like silk, and Paris noticed. In 1795, she met Napoleon. He was awkward, intense, and wildly ambitious. She was graceful, poised, and 10 years older. She called him Bonaparte. He called her Joséphine. He fell so hard, so fast, that he sent her love letters dripping with desperation. She didn't respond with the same heat, at least not at first. But when they married in 1796, it wasn't just romance, it was strategy, for both of them. While Napoleon was off conquering Italy, Joséphine remained in Paris, entertaining, lavishly, famously, and allegedly, not always alone. Rumors of infidelity swirled. Napoleon, riding from the battlefield, was tortured by jealousy. But Joséphine knew how to play the game. When he returned victorious, she melted back into his favor. He forgave. For a while. Their relationship was a dance of passion and betrayal. Joséphine struggled to produce an heir, and her past constantly threatened her future. But Napoleon couldn't let her go. She was his charm, his obsession, his empress. In 1804, when he crowned himself Emperor of the French, he turned to Joséphine, placed a crown upon her head, and declared her his equal, not because the Church said so, not because tradition demanded it, but because he wanted her there, beside him, as the living symbol of his rise. But power has no patience for sentiment. By 1810, with no heir and the weight of empire pressing down, Napoleon divorced Joséphine. She wept. He wept. It was one of the few moments in his life that cracked his stone facade. She retired to her estate at Malmaison, where she surrounded herself with gardens, artists, and her beloved pets, including an exotic menagerie of monkeys, birds, and her infamous roses. She died in 1814, still adored by the public, still beloved by Napoleon who, even in exile on St. Helena, murmured her name before dying. Why was Joséphine Bonaparte extreme? Because she survived revolution, seduced an emperor, and reigned without needing to conquer a single battlefield. Because she turned femininity into diplomacy, sensuality into strategy, and scandal into sovereignty. Because she was France's first empress not by blood, but by force of presence. And as Joséphine's perfume lingers in the marble halls of history, another queen prepares to enter the Seigneur who wore no wedding ring, ruled alone, and defied every suitor with a glance and a nation at her back. Elizabeth I. She was the queen who never married, the ruler who claimed her country as her husband, the virgin queen, who ruled for 45 years without ever taking a king and whose personal life remains one of history's most studied, speculated, and sensationalized puzzles. Elizabeth I of England, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, was born in 1533 under a storm cloud of expectation and disappointment. Her father wanted a son. He got Elizabeth. Her mother was executed when Elizabeth was just 2 years old, declared illegitimate, raised in the political crossfire of Tudor court life, and shuffled between palaces like a valuable but inconvenient heir. Elizabeth learned early that survival wasn't about charm, it was about calculation. And calculate she did. When her half-sister Mary I died in 1558, Elizabeth ascended the throne. She was 25 years old, unmarried and already whispered about. Her reign began with skepticism. Could a woman rule without a man beside her? Would she marry? Would she bear heirs? Would England crumble without a king? She never gave them what they wanted. Instead, she gave them an era. Elizabeth ruled through the age of Shakespeare, of Drake, of Raleigh, of colonization and court intrigue. Her court was a stage, and she was its star, sovereign, dressed in velvet and pearls, her fiery red hair piled high like a flame refusing to go out. She mastered the art of public image long before the phrase existed. Every portrait, every proclamation, every performance was rehearsed, polished, and perfectly timed. But behind the royal facade was a woman constantly under scrutiny. Her private life was a subject of obsessive fascination. She never married, never had children, and yet she was never alone. Her court swarmed with ambitious men, suitors from across Europe, and lifelong favorites who danced dangerously close to her throne and her heart. Chief among them was Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. They had known each other since childhood. When Elizabeth became queen, Dudley became her master of the horsey title that allowed near-constant access to her private chambers. The court buzzed with gossip. They were inseparable, intimate, and very likely in love, but there was a problem. Dudley was married. When his wife, Amy Robsart, died from a suspicious fall down a staircase, the rumor mill exploded. Murder? Accident? Suicide? No one knew. But the scandal was enough to make marriage politically impossible. Elizabeth may have loved Dudley, but she loved her throne more. Still, she kept him close. For decades. Even when she flirted with foreign princes and entertained marriage proposals from kings, it was Dudley's name that remained tethered to hers. When he died in 1588, she locked herself in her chamber for days, refusing food and company. There were others. Christopher Hatton, Walter Raleigh, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, a man 20 years her junior who called her "my fair queen," and once burst into her bedroom unannounced. Elizabeth had him executed after he tried to lead a rebellion, but even then she reportedly mourned him. Her love life was never public, but it was always political. And that was the brilliance and tragedy of Elizabeth. She turned her unmarried status into a weapon. As long as she remained single, she could play European powers against each other, keep her nobles hopeful, and maintain the fiction of virgin sovereignty. Her body was never her own, but she used it to rule. Why was Elizabeth I extreme? Because she made celibacy look like strength. Because she turned a lifetime of loneliness into a dynasty of power. Because she rejected every convention of womanhood in favor of empire and succeeded. Not by accident. Not by default, but by sheer, blinding will. And as the sun sets on Gloriana's golden reign, another woman rises not as a queen of diplomacy, but as a countess of nightmares, whose legacy is written in blood, locked behind castle walls, and whispered with a shudder across centuries. Countess Erzsébet Bathory. Her name is carved in bone and blood. Erzsébet Bathory. The blood countessas haunted the edges of European history like a crimson shadow. Was she a sadistic murderer, bathing in the blood of virgins? Or a powerful woman destroyed by those who feared her? History can't decide. But the myth? The myth is immortal. Born in 1560 into the noble Bathory family of Hungary, Erzsébet was royalty from the cradle. Her lineage was tangled with powerful warriors, kings, and cardinals. Her family ruled Transylvania. She grew up in castles, spoke 4 languages by the age of 10, and was promised in marriage before she hit puberty. By the standards of the time, she was a catch, and also a problem. Even as a girl, Elizabeth had a reputation for mood swings, outbursts, and an unsettling fascination with pain. There are stories, maybe legends, maybe warnings of her watching brutal punishments administered to servants, and even participating in them. But these tales come wrapped in centuries of exaggeration. What we know. At 15, she married Ferenc Nadezhdy, a warrior aristocrat known as the Black Knight of Hungary. The match was political, strategic, classic noble fare. But Ferenc, though a brutal soldier, was often away at war, leaving Elizabeth in control of the estate. She managed vast lands, hundreds of servants, and the day-to-day affairs of a noble household. And that's when things get strange. When Ferenc died in 1604, rumors began to swirl. Servants disappeared. Peasants whispered. Girls from nearby villages went to work in the castle and never came back. At first, it was local gossip, but soon the whispers grew loud enough that they reached the ears of the Hungarian authorities. By 1610, Count György Thurzo, the king's representative, launched an investigation. What he claimed to find was staggering. Dozens of girls, maybe hundreds tortured, mutilated, killed within the walls of Sede Castle. Witnesses testified to nightmarish scenes, girls beaten, burned, frozen, starved. Some claimed Elizabeth bit chunks of flesh from her victims. Others said she pierced their fingers with needles, stitched their lips closed, and forced them to eat their own flesh. And yes, some swore she bathed in virgin blood to preserve her youth. The image of the bloodbath stuck. It was too perfect, too grotesquely cinematic. But was it true? Some historians argue the entire case was fabricated, a political takedown, engineered by rivals, hungry for her land and power. A widow with no male protector was an easy target. Others say the evidence letters, testimony, bodiesis too overwhelming to dismiss. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. A powerful woman, feared and hated, whose real cruelty was twisted into monstrous legend. Either way, she was arrested, but not executed. Her noble birth protected her. While her servants were tortured and burned, Elizabeth was confined to her own castle. Sealed in a bricked-up room with no windows, only a small slot for food. She lived like that for 4 years until she died in 1614. Her name became legend. She was compared to Vlad the Impaler, inspired Gothic novels, became a staple of vampire folklore. Long before Dracula made his mark, Elizabeth was the original countess of the macabre young women drained of life, a castle drenched in cruelty, a noble woman whose beauty curdled into horror. Why was Elizabeth Bathory extreme? Because she blurs the line between history and myth like blood smeared across parchment. Because she represents the ultimate dark twist on female power, unmarried, uncontrolled, and unrelenting. Because whether she was a serial killer or a scapegoat, her story drips with terror, fascination, and a warning. In a world that fears powerful women, sometimes the scariest thing isn't what they did, it's what people say they did. And now, as the castle doors creak closed behind us, we turn to the last queen on our list, a woman famed not for cruelty, but for beauty, mystery, and a longing for freedom so fierce it made her the most iconic royal rebel of her age. Empress Elizabeth of Austria. She was called Cixi by those who adored her. Empress of Austria, Queen of Hungary, wife to Emperor Franz Joseph I. But beneath the tiara and titles, Elizabeth of Bavaria lived a life that read more like tragic poetry than royal decree. She was a beauty turned prisoner, a rebel in a gilded cage. and a woman who spent her entire life trying to run fast enough to catch herself. Born in 1837 in the lush countryside of Bavaria, Cixi was never meant to be an empress. Her cousin was supposed to marry the emperor. But when the 15-year-old Cixi arrived in Vienna, Franz Joseph took one look at her and changed the script. He fell instantly, hopelessly in love. Within a year, they were married. She was 16, a teenager in a world of protocol, powdered wigs, and terrifying expectations. From the beginning, Cixi felt out of place. The Viennese court was cold, rigid, ruled by her iron-fisted mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, who believed Cixi was too young, too emotional, too undisciplined. Her children were taken from her. Her every move was monitored. Even her wardrobe became political theater. The empress was expected to represent not just Austria, but perfection. So she gave them perfection. She became obsessed with beauty. Her waist, famously tinysome, say just 18 inches, was cinched tighter than any corset could bear. She maintained her figure with starvation diets, hours of exercise, and an iron will. Her hair, famously long and thick, cascaded past her knees and took hours to maintain daily. Servants were forbidden from commenting on her beauty routine. It was a ritual, a religion. But Cixi's body became her battlefield. She had lovers, allegedly, though none confirmed. She distanced herself from her husband, traveled constantly, and wrote melancholy poetry under a pseudonym. Her verses dripped with despair, existential questions, and a longing to dissolve into anonymity. She wandered through Hungary, Switzerland, Greece, always fleeing, never arriving. Hungary, in particular, won her heart. She learned the language, befriended its people, and played a crucial role in reconciling Hungary with the Habsburg crown. In 1867, she was crowned Queen of Hungary, not as a figurehead, but as a political actor. She had influence, she had agency, but not peace. Her private life was a chamber of grief. Her son, Crown Prince Rudolph, troubled, passionate, politically liberal, was her mirror. In 1889, he and his teenage mistress were found dead in an apparent suicide pact at Mayerling. The scandal shattered Cixi. She dressed in black for the rest of her life, as if mourning not only her son, but herself. She refused to be photographed, refused to sit for portraits, refused to eat in public. She became a ghost with a crown haunting Europe's royal courts like a living elegy. She was the empress, but she wasn't there. And then, in 1898, came the final chapter. While walking along the shores of Lake Geneva, Cixi was stabbed in the chest by an Italian anarchist. The blade was thin, her corset so tight that the wound initially went unnoticed. She collapsed slowly, like a fading opera note. By the time they realized what had happened, it was too late. She died the way she had lived, gracefully, tragically, and just out of reach. Why was Empress Elizabeth extreme? Because she was a queen who spent her life trying to escape the crown. Because she turned beauty into armor and sadness into poetry. Because she defied expectations not through revolution, but through quiet rebellion. And because her legacy, like her silhouette, still lingers elegant, elusive, and utterly uncontainable. And so our journey ends, not with a scream, but with a whisper. 30 queens, 30 flames, 30 women who lived too fiercely, loved too freely, and ruled whether with swords or seduction in ways history tried to bury, but never could.